Story 1. The Salt Roads of Samarkand. You are standing at the edge of the great trading city of Samarkand. It is the late 13th century. Before you stretches a long, sun-cracked road lined with low, brush-covered hills and dotted with clumps of trudging pack animals. You can smell the dust long before you taste it, feel the coarse air whip past your face. The road is dry, but it carries a strange scent. Not spices, not manure salt. The kind of salt that clings to your tongue for hours, making everything taste like brine. This is the Salt Road of Samarkand, one of the less glamorous arteries of the Silk Road. You might imagine silk brocades, glowing lanterns, and camel caravans with shimmering banners. But this is mostly donkey dung, cracked leather saddlebags, long-winded toll negotiations, and bags of coarse mineral salt harvested from dry inland lakes and distant, sunken mines. Yet this road and others like it were the lifeblood of medieval Central Asia. The geography of salt. Salt was not evenly distributed in the ancient world. Some lands were cursed with too much of it, others barely had enough to season a bowl of boiled millet. The Fergana Valley, to the east of Samarkand, held rich saline deposits. From the dry plains near Lake Tuzcan to the mountain-bordered salt pans of Isfara, salt was drawn, dried, bagged, and loaded onto animals for transport. Salt then became a logistical problem, a heavy, essential, often dull mineral with outsized value. People needed it to preserve food, tan hides, make medicines, and satisfy livestock. Wars were not fought over it often, but many dull border squabbles and taxation disputes absolutely were. Samarkand, located at a commercial crossroads, became a funnel for salt, particularly on the route westward toward Khwarezm and the Caspian Basin. But the true obstacle wasn't distance, it was regulation. The taxman rests at no yurt. Salt was taxed, heavily, and not just at one point. Oh no, you paid at the salt mine itself, then at the local township for a movement license. Then again as you crossed out of the region. If you happened to pass into a territory controlled by a rival Mongol prince, say, a cousin of the Khan, another tax. Marco Polo, traveling not as a merchant but with the protection of Mongol passports known as paisa, still took careful note of these checkpoints. While he may have glossed over the details in his dictated memoirs, Venetian trading records and some Yuan dynasty administrative logs reveal a dizzying array of duties. Salt import duties, salt handling fees, dust levy, yes, for the wear and tear caused by dusty roads, animal labor taxes, and even a mule perspiration duty in certain areas, likely a creative term for a livestock usage tax. One particular checkpoint south of Samarkand was run by a minor functionary named Yelbeg Tamir. He kept a meticulous record of every sack, animal, and copper coin that crossed his dusty station. His logbook, copied by scribes for training new tax officials, still survives in fragments. His entries include long-winded descriptions of the odor quality of salt and how it correlated to its price. Yes, there were standards. Salt delivered from the Tuscan mines, fourth rotation of spring, was yellow and bitter to taste, suitable only for preserving animal hides. Value, 1 coin per measure. Excerpt from the Yelbeg Tamir Road Log, 1275. The men and mules who moved it. You wouldn't have seen proud, high-ranking merchants on the salt roads. No, this work was too grubby, too basic. Instead, caravans were driven by the poor but essential class of traveling teamsters, many of them Sogdian or Uyghur. They were often semi-literate, hardened, and underfed. These drivers, or yarkach, relied on a set of unspoken rules. Camp at least 200 paces from another salt caravan to avoid theft. Share well water but not food unless necessary. Repair your bags every 3 days or risk a fine at delivery. And always bribe the salt inspectors lightly but early. Salt itself was carried in stitched goatskin bags, designed to be waterproof but breathable. Each bag weighed about 30 kilograms when full and would leak if overfilled. A typical caravan might carry 1–2 tons, using a mix of pack mules, donkeys, and the occasional Bactrian camel for longer hauls. Mules required careful packing. Too fast and they would sweat too much, spoiling the salt. Too slow and you'd be late to market. Entire manuals were written about the speed of salt. Let no caravan exceed 10 stads an hour on sun-heated roads, else the outer salt will cake and the inner rot. Advice to salt drivers, see 1250. Even this boring detail had economic consequences. Caked or spoiled salt could be rejected by buyers in Khiva or Urgench, leading to loss not just of profits but of trade privileges. More than once, caravans were banned from cities due to low-quality salt and animal odor. These weren't dramatic failures but slow, plodding, bureaucratic collapses. The role of women in the salt trade. Curiously, women played a role not just in packaging salt at extraction sites, but also as local regulators and customs collectors. In areas controlled by Mongol women, especially the wives or mothers of regional khans, women often took on administrative roles. In Samarkand's northern quarter, a toll post was run by a woman named Amina the Recorder, who was renowned for refusing bribes but rewarding well-packed caravans with low tax rates. Her surviving seals show a strict sense of fairness and an alarming attention to how animals were loaded. A poem survives, supposedly written by a driver in her district. Fair Amina sees the mule's sweat before she sees the coin, but she marks not the man's clothes / only the salt's true weight. Amina's inspections often took hours, leading to the formation of salt tea stalls, nearby humble tents where drivers drank boiled herbs and played guessing games about her mood that day. Some travelers claimed her presence slowed caravans more than sandstorms. The hidden cost of boredom. Salt drove much of the day-to-day commerce along this portion of the Silk Road, but few celebrated it. It wasn't rare or flashy. It didn't get embroidered onto tunics or carved into jewelry. Yet without it, food spoiled, medicine failed, and armies went hungry. What's remarkable isn't the salt itself, but the human system that developed to control, move, and monetize it. Dozens of small towns existed only to support the salt routes, places where nothing was produced except rest, rope, and receipts. Tax documents traveled faster than salt caravans, and paperwork often outlived the salt it documented. It is no surprise, then, that Marco Polo, though immersed in the grand courts of Kublai Khan, noticed the dull precision of the salt trade. In one account, he mentions a man who made a fortune counting grains, which likely refers to a regional quality controller. This wasn't exotic or romantic, but it was reliable. And that was what empires, especially the Mongol ones, truly needed. Not excitement, but systematized dullness. Things that moved, products that obeyed weight, moisture, and value. People who complied with regulation not because they were inspired, but because they were tired. Unresolved thought. As the sun sets behind the low hills, casting long shadows across the dusty road, you might wonder not about the salt itself, but the sheer number of hands it passed through. How many lives were shaped not by gold or glory, but by a simple mineral, sweating mules, and the persistence of paperwork. You return to the salt road after a night of fitful sleep, curled next to a half-empty goatskin bag and the slow huff of your exhausted mule. The sun is rising again, pale and relentless, and with it comes another day of planning, plotting, and parley. In the 13th century, a journey from the salt pans of the eastern Fergana Valley to the bustling markets of Samarkand took anywhere from 20 to 40 days, depending on weather, checkpoints, mule health, and perhaps most unpredictably paperwork delays. In this section, we look at the slow-turning wheels of salt trade bureaucracy, interpersonal disputes between traders, and the curious concept of lateness in a pre-clock society. Time delays and the concept of late. To begin, we must shed our modern idea of lateness. In the 1200s, no one had clocks accurate to the minute, nor did traders carry wristwatches or pocket timepieces. Time was measured in sun shadows, in the length of prayer chants, or the number of paces it took to wear down a mule's hooves. Even so, merchants and tax officials developed astonishingly precise expectations for when a caravan should arrive. These were calculated in units such as gunluk daily distance, bazar ra market roads, and march lengths. A salt caravan was expected to cover about 20-25 kilometers per day under ideal circumstances. Local inspectors kept ledgers not just of quantities, but of estimated arrival dates. Arrive too soon and you might be suspected of skipping a tax post. Too late, and your delivery value might drop due to market glut penalties. Salt's worth changed weekly, sometimes daily, depending on weather, incoming competition, and the whims of local governors. To hedge against lateness, many caravans employed a kisabgar, a journey accountant who carried not just money, but also a set of excuse letters. These were pre-written documents citing plausible reasons for delay. Rain-flooded pass, stolen hoof nails, spiritual interference from a shrine, pregnant mule, sudden market closure due to governor's illness. Each letter had to be signed by a credible figure, most often a town elder, temple scribe, or minor bureaucrat, and would be presented at checkpoints. A good kisabgar was worth his weight in preserved lemons. Bureaucracy as a system of trust and distrust. The Mongol Empire, while famed for its brutal conquests, relied on surprisingly efficient systems of trade, taxation, and record-keeping. Salt trade, being so vital yet so dull, was the perfect testing ground for bureaucratic innovation. Paperwork was carried in tubes made from bark, horn, or folded cloth sealed with wax. Each roll contained not just quantities and taxes paid, but also livestock usage, expected route, and names of every responsible individual in the caravan hierarchy. Interestingly, failure to produce a complete document set could lead to what was known as a slow fine, not an immediate penalty, but a mandated delay at the checkpoint of 1 to 3 days. This punishment was psychological. Time meant spoilage. Time meant missed buyers. One log from 1274 describes a caravan halted for 2 full days because the 4th mule was listed as gray in paperwork but appeared mottled in real life. A second inspection was required. The actual fine, 1 copper coin, but the delay, costly. These small indignities wore down merchants more than sandstorms. A man named Khurshid of Talas recorded in his personal journey notes, "Let the heavens drown me in rain before I face another junior official with eyes like a hawk and soul like a stump." Salt disputes and caravan etiquette. With so many caravans plying the salt road, some carrying different grades, some converging from rival regions, conflicts were inevitable. Not over salt itself, but over spacing, access to water wells, and accusation of theft or sabotage. Disputes were usually settled by salt mediators, locally appointed figures known as sulhnama men, or keepers of the quiet. These men traveled on foot or with light mules and carried scales, inspection slates, and mediation slips. Their job was not to punish but to pacify. They would examine the salt for tampering or dilution. Adding pebbles was a common trick. Interview mule handlers separately. Inspect hoofprints near alleged thefts. Issue a binding ruling, often based on compensation in kind, salt, tack, or food. The rulings were respected because violating them meant being blacklisted from water stations or toll booths, a near-death sentence for any caravan. A surviving sulhnama slip from 1283 reads, "Caravan of Jamal wrongfully encamped near well of bitter spring. Caused fright to donkeys of caravan of Usted Hekmat. 3 bags found opened. No tampering. Compensation, 2 bags lent to be repaid in Bukhara." Some disputes ended peacefully with shared food and storytelling. Others ended with a quiet fistfight behind a rest tent. But rarely did they escalate because everyone knew that salt trade survival relied on shared rules, even if enforced through yawning boredom. The daily life of a salt driver. What did a normal day look like for a salt trader in the year 1276? Dawn, wake before light. Boil leftover millet and brine turnip. Check salt bags for leaks. Morning, load animals. Apply balm to sore mule backs. Adjust weight so no animal carried more than its quota. Midday, stop at a caravanserai if lucky, or make shade under a cloth tent. Drink diluted vinegar water. Afternoon, inspect documents. Avoid speeding up pace during windstorms. Evening, stop 10-15 paces from other camps. Cook bland porridge. Record day's progress with a stick or notch rope. Repetition, discipline, and attention to minor detail define the work. It was not a heroic life, but it was a vital one. The best drivers were not the strongest, they were the most boringly consistent. A preserved driver's journal from the Karshi region includes 31 consecutive entries that read, "No incident, mule number 2 limping, salt seems unaffected, dust light, spirits low." The role of caravanserais and the salt inns. Dotting the road between Fergana and Samarkand were caravanserais, fortified inns built to house traders, guards, and sometimes local inspectors. While many catered to silk and spice merchants, a few were specifically designed for salt drivers. These salt inns were humble. Stone pens for animals, hard earthen floors, low fires for boiling water. Yet they served as social hubs. Stories were exchanged, warnings passed along, and minor black market trades took place under the noses of tired innkeepers. Each salt inn had its own culture. Inn of the Red Stones near Panjikent, known for its honesty but sour food. Dusty Roof House, southwest of Urgut, famous for salt carving competitions on rest days. The Mule's Whisper, north of Den, allegedly haunted by a donkey who could predict tax increases. Whether or not the mule existed, these places offered mental relief. For men and women doing exhausting, monotonous work, they were a space to be human again. Notes on Marco Polo's passing mention. Marco Polo's actual references to salt are few and passing. In the Travels, he notes regions where the salt is drawn like stone, and markets which value the white stones more than coin. But behind these brief lines lie years of lived monotony. In one recorded anecdote, Polo mentions an official in Bukhara who built a house entirely of salt bricks to impress his father-in-law. While likely apocryphal or symbolic, the notion reveals just how essential and respected salt could be, not for luxury, but for endurance. The Venetian merchant may not have dwelled on salt roads in his tales, but the merchants he encountered, the delays he suffered, and the people who fed and housed him all depended on that boring minerals movement. Paper versus salt, an administrative duel. Perhaps the most curious bureaucratic rivalry of the Salt Road was not between merchants, but between two record keepers. In 1272, a noted inspector named Barlak the Ledger from the West Samarkand checkpoint got into a decade-long dispute with a rival official, Hamid of the Red Stamp from Bukhara. Their argument: how many salt loads per mule should be allowed under new moisture guidelines. Barlak claimed that a well-fed mule could carry 3 bags in dry season. Hamid insisted that humidity rendered the 3rd bag impure and unfit for tax declaration. They wrote no fewer than 47 letters to the regional governor. Eventually, the governor ruled, "Let salt and paper, not war. Fix limit to 2.5 bags, round down when in doubt." This ruling became known as the Salt Compromise and was later copied in administrative manuals across the Khanate. The squabble taught later officials an important lesson: too much bureaucracy could slow even the most necessary trade. Unresolved thought. So much of the Salt Road was shaped by people you've never heard of: men who walked beside mules, women who checked ledgers, and clerks who argued about bag limits. It's easy to dismiss their work, but without them, would Marco Polo have ever reached the East? Would the spices, silks, and philosophies of Asia have ever made it west. Salt may not sparkle, but it carried an empire. By now you have traveled with the salt. You've endured the dust, felt the soft chafing of goatskin bags against weary mules, and weathered the petty tolls, the clerical errors, and the slow-moving machine of Mongol administration. But salt's story does not end on the road. It ends, if such a word can be used, with its consumption, regulation, and subtle entanglement in imperial politics. This section follows salt's quiet arrival in the heart of empires, and the not-so-boring consequences that trickled outward, one grain at a time. Arrival at the salt markets of Samarkand. When a caravan finally arrived at the gates of Samarkand, the journey wasn't over, not by a long stretch. First, there was the entry tax distinct from the road tolls. Then, inspection by weight officers at the Darugha's office, a Mongol-appointed city governor. The salt was unloaded under guard and assessed for quality, dryness, and odor. Any bag suspected of dilution or moisture damage was placed in quarantine for up to 7 days. Only then could it be passed into the custody of a licensed merchant guild, known as the Tajirani Namak Salt Traders Union, who handled final sale and redistribution. The Samarkand salt market was not a bazaar in the loud, colorful sense. It was quiet. Shaded awnings, mules tied in neat rows, ledger stones where deals were scratched in lime chalk. Salt was serious business. And yet, even in seriousness, the absurd crept in. One local law prohibited shouting in the salt market, claiming it disrupted the spiritual resonance of the mineral. Another required buyers to sample salt with the left hand only, for reasons lost to time but still enforced by a particularly pedantic inspector named Juving. It was in this oddly ceremonial space that caravan drivers finally received their payment measured in coppers, or sometimes in kind, grain, fabrics, even fresh sandals. A driver might spend a full year moving 24 bags of salt, endure sandstorms, muggings, and mule deaths, and walk away with just enough to buy his next year's rations and one new cooking pot. Salt in the Mongol imperial engine. Kublai Khan understood the importance of salt, even if he rarely handled it personally. In the Yuan court, salt was a major source of steady, predictable revenue. Unlike silk or gold, which fluctuated wildly in value, salt could be counted on. It never went out of fashion. Everyone needed it all the time. The Yuan government used salt in 2 key ways. Revenue extraction. Through monopolies and licensing, the empire extracted wealth from producers, traders, and consumers. A peasant in Zhejiang buying a pinch of salt paid a tax that eventually funded military garrisons, palace-building projects, and court rituals. Food security and army provisioning. Salt was essential for preserving meat and fish, which in turn fed troops spread across the vast Mongol realm. A delay in salt delivery to a barracks near the western border could mean spoiled rations, lowered morale, and logistical nightmares. Because of this, some salt roads received imperial oversight, including yam stations, the Mongol postal system, to speed urgent loads. Others operated at the margins, left to merchant guilds under heavy surveillance. In 1280, an edict from Candlelight, modern-day Beijing, ordered that salt caravans of acceptable moisture be given second-level travel passports, marking them as semi-official conveyors of sustenance. This gave salt drivers limited protection from bandits and a degree of legal immunity. But it also meant more paperwork, counterfeiting salt, and the rise of smuggling. Where value concentrates, deception follows. Salt was no exception. Smugglers became a persistent problem across the Mongol world. In some regions, they diluted salt with powdered stone or sand. In others, they repurposed official salt bags, refilling them with lesser-grade salt and forging the inspection stamps. The Mongol authorities responded with measures that were both inventive and deeply dull. Introduction of salt stamping tablets. small wood blocks used to mark each bag with the inspector's sigil. Issuance of odor profiles, scrolls describing the smell of acceptable salt from each region. Deployment of taste officials, men trained to taste and verify the origin of salt, many of whom developed ulcers and lost most of their teeth. The punishment for smuggling salt varied. A minor infraction might result in bag confiscation. Repeat offenses could bring exile, forced labor, or in rare cases, execution. But punishment didn't always deter. Salt smuggling often paid better than legitimate trade. One infamous woman in the Bactria region, Zura the mulekeeper, ran a secret salt ring for 6 years under the guise of delivering millet. Her empire crumbled when a mule brayed at the wrong checkpoint. Still, her legend outlived her bags. When salt becomes memory, we often forget that much of our historical understanding comes not from kings and generals, but from records of things like salt sales. In the archives of Samarkand, dusty ledgers speak louder than monuments. One page from 1293 lists 46 bags of salt from Lake Tuscan, fairly dry. 3 mules declared overburdened. 2 salt disputes resolved by Amina the recorder. 1 driver lost to thirst, remembered by song. Even in death, a salt trader became part of the system, recorded, taxed, buried, and mourned through the same bureaucracy that consumed him. Marco Polo never met these men, but he benefited from their labor every time he salted a meal in Kublai Khan's court. Modern echoes of the salt roads. The salt roads of Samarkand faded with the fall of the Mongol Empire. Trade shifted. Maritime routes gained prominence. Samarkand lost its centrality, but the structures created for salt roadside inspections, standardized weights, dry storage, water rations, bribe limits became models for other goods. Salt was never the star, but it was always the infrastructure, and that's the great lesson here. Today, you can still find remnants of the salt roads, worn stones near Dennau, faded inscriptions on collapsed inns, a ledger fragment preserved in a Bukhara museum, cataloging salt and mule deaths in the year 1301. Some of those stones might still smell faintly of brine if the wind hits them right. Final reflection: the boring gravity of boring things. What makes a civilization run? Not always its art, nor its armies, nor its philosophy. Often it's the unnoticed things, the grain bags, the soap pots, the salt. Salt demanded discipline. It required honesty. It punished carelessness with spoilage and rewarded dull consistency with survival. Those who moved it were rarely celebrated, but they were essential. Marco Polo's adventures, for all their grandeur, were scaffolded upon these quiet systems. Without the mule driver, the toll collector, the packer, and the ledger scribe, there would be no journey to tell. And so perhaps the salt roads weren't boring at all. They were just consistent, predictable, steady, and in an unpredictable world, that's what made them powerful. Even in boredom, there is empire. Story 2. How to buy a horse in 13th century Bukhara. You arrive in Bukhara just after sunrise, your sandals caked with road dust, your purse only slightly heavier than your resolve. You are here for a horse. Not just any horse, but one fit for the road, a strong, even-tempered beast capable of hauling salt or goods, carrying letters for the Mongol post, or simply surviving in the harsh steppe. It is the year 1277. The Mongol Empire spans from the Yellow Sea to the edge of Hungary, and Bukhara is one of its glittering commercial hubs. But the horse trade here is no fairy tale. There are no gallant steeds, no golden reins. There is mud. There is shouting. There is paperwork, and more often than not, there is disappointment. Because buying a horse in 13th century Bukhara was less about grandeur and more about surviving a slow, grinding ritual of negotiation, inspection, and record-keeping. The horse yard, where dust meets commerce. The horse yard, known locally as Bazar Ryasp, was located just beyond the city's fortified wall, near the southern gate. It sprawled over several flat acres of packed earth and straw. This was no polished stable. It was a cacophony of tail-swishing, fly-swatting, stubborn, stomping beasts penned between woven reed fences. Here, sellers gathered at dawn, lining up horses by breed, region, and temperament. You would not find sleek Arabian racers here. This was a yard of practicality Bactrian stock, Fergana mares, and occasionally, rough mountain ponies from Badakhshan. Horses were valued less for beauty than for what they could endure: distance, cold, load, and poorly tied saddlebags. Each horse bore a tag, tied to the halter with knotted string. These tags, wooden slats or folded paper seals, listed the horse's basic features: age, region of origin, number of owners, feeding type grain, grass, or mixed, number of teeth missing, yes, it mattered, work experience, e.g. salt hauling, wool train, postal courier. If the tag was missing, the price went down, not because the horse was necessarily bad, but because trust in this world was built on tags and testimonies, not appearances. The first rule of horse buying: trust no one but smile often. The process of buying a horse in Bukhara began with feigned disinterest. You never walked straight to the horse you wanted. That showed weakness. Instead, you examined 3 or 4 others first, asked pointless questions, muttered about hoof cracks, and only then drifted toward your target. Then began the Avali Guftugu, the first conversation. This was not negotiation. It was theater. You asked the seller about the horse's history. He told you a story. Sometimes it was even true. This mare once carried a messenger for the Khan himself. She sleeps only when told. This gelding stood still during a thunderstorm while all others ran. A gift from the shrine of Bibi Khanim. No fleas, no ghosts, no stubbornness, only forward. Behind the seller stood a handler, often a boy no older than 12, whose job was to lead the horse through a small walking loop. You watched the hooves, you watched the ears, you watched the tail, all while pretending not to care. Then you asked the first price: currency, credit, and the confusing math of Mongol-era payments. Prices were quoted in a variety of units. Silver tankas most common. Copper fullis small chain. Bartered goods cloth, salt, grain, occasionally livestock. Credit slips backed by merchant guilds. A medium-quality pack horse might go for 1822 tankas. A step-born beast with Mongol approval could command double. But most horses were sold with options half up front, half on delivery, or payments staggered through caravan partnerships. To protect both buyer and seller, a third party called the WASI Macron letter 1E60, a H, acted as guarantor. These men were chosen for their neutrality, usually respected elders or scribes, and they carried small seal stamps to notarize the deal. One copy of the agreement stayed with the buyer. The other was filed at the local stable registry, maintained by the governor's office. This may sound excessive for a single animal, but remember, horses were infrastructure. They could be loaned, taxed, conscripted, or stolen. Without proof of ownership, you might lose not just the horse but any chance at justice. Equine bureaucracy, the Mongol stamp of ownership. Under Mongol rule, horses were subject to periodic inspections, especially if you planned to cross into another territory or use imperial roads. Your new horse had to be registered at the city stable, vaccinated by pouring herbal tinctures down the nose, issued a movement token, pay as a asp, verified for fit hoofwear, standardized to region. The stable registry was run by clerks known as isbdarin, often retired horse trainers or former caravan guards. They wore gray tunics and carried long sticks, not for discipline, but to tap hooves and listen for hollowness. Once registered, your horse was branded with a faint mark near the upper thigh, not visible from a distance, but enough to prove identity in case of disputes. Sometimes, buyers requested invisible brands made from herbal paste, to keep thieves guessing. These wore off in a few months, but that was often long enough to reach your destination. The hidden hands, brokers, fixers, and honest liars. No one bought a horse in Bukhara alone. Even if you thought you were acting solo, someone was watching. Brokers known as Dalal patrolled the yard offering help. Some were helpful. Others were paid by sellers to accidentally nudge you toward a particular animal. These brokers had a language of winks, hand flicks, and coughing fit signals that indicated price flexibility, known illnesses, recent overwork, ghost reputation, i.e., rumors of cursed riders. One common trick involved distracting the buyer with praise, while another broker quietly slapped the horse's rump to get it to trot proudly. Or, if the horse had a limp, they'd dust the ground with vinegar to harden the hooves for a short time. And yet, despite all this trickery, most buyers knew the risks. The goal wasn't to find the perfect horse, it was to find one good enough for your needs, at a price you could defend if questioned. In fact, most of the negotiation was aimed not at the price but at blame insurance. If something went wrong later, the seller could point to the tag, the handler's loop, the broker's words. Everyone had plausible deniability. Test rides and the mule yard of shame. Once a price was loosely agreed, the buyer had the right to a test ride. You mounted the horse, often with a borrowed saddle and lead rope, and rode a short loop behind the yard, a narrow alleyway known jokingly as Dar al-Shak, the Court of Doubt. Here, stable boys watched to see if you handled the horse well. Why? Because how you rode told the seller everything about your future complaints. If you were too rough, they braced for hoof injuries. If too timid, they expected you to blame the horse's stubbornness. Some sellers even offered a polite ride discount if they liked your style. If the horse bucked or bit well, you could back out, but only once. Calling off 2 test rides in a row marked you as a mujadil, time waster, and some brokers would refuse to work with you again. Buyers who pushed their luck too often were relegated to the mule yard, where lesser animals and less patient sellers did business. The mule yard of shame, while not official, was well understood. Unresolved thought. As the sun begins its climb, casting long shadows across the horse yard, you prepare to shake hands on the price. The seller's smile is tired. The broker has already moved on to someone else. Your horse, if the paperwork goes through, will be yours by sunset. But you hesitate not because of the money, or the horse, or the risk. You hesitate because somewhere in this dust-choked city, a scribe is reaching for a blank piece of parchment to begin your ownership ledger. And you wonder, in a world of so many animals, so many riders, so many seals and brands who will remember this horse after it's gone. Your name is now on a ledger. The horse is tied loosely to a weathered post just outside the stable registry. It flicks its tail in the direction of a tea seller's kettle steam, unbothered by the heat, the city noise, or your nerves. You have officially purchased a horse in 13th century Bukhara. But the transaction is far from over. This section traces what happened after the money changed hands, when ownership shifted from rumor to recognition, and when the most critical part of the process began, proving that the horse was not only yours, but acceptable for travel, taxation, and trade in a tightly controlled and closely observed world. Ownership as identity. Ownership of a horse in Bukhara was less about possession than permission. You needed permission to keep the horse in city limits overnight, permission to feed it from communal troughs, permission to ride it through trade checkpoints, and most importantly, permission to prove that you were the rightful owner in a world where seals were more important than names. The proof of ownership was documented in the Asbnama, or horse letter. It was handwritten by a stable clerk on waxed parchment or sturdy cloth, stamped with a red wax seal and signed by 3 witnesses typically. The seller, the buyer you, a local broker, or the WAS Imacron letter 1E6D, a H, guarantor. Your ASP-NAMA listed the horse's identifying features: color, sex, age, scars, gait type, and lineage, if known. A unique brand symbol was usually sketched on the corner of the document. But identity verification didn't stop there. The document had to be logged with the Dar al-Asp, the regional horse registry, whose clerks recorded the transaction on a separate master scroll known as the Rakam al-Milkiya, or Roll of Possession. These scrolls were periodically inspected by Mongol auditors. Why? Because horses were taxable assets, and because the empire's supply of postal and military mounts depended on accurate records. Oath, salt, and social signatures. Before you could take the horse beyond city boundaries, a curious ritual was required. In a dusty courtyard near the main registry, you and the seller met again before a clerk, who administered a truth oath. You each swore that the horse had not been stolen, was not diseased, and was not under a Safar man, a kind of travel ban issued on animals suspected of harboring plague or hoof disease. The oath was spoken while touching two items: a clod of local salt, representing trade honesty; a piece of horse tack, bridle or rein, representing control and authority. Breaking this oath, if proven later, was punishable by public shamming, often a slow parade through the market square with a broken rein tied around one's neck. Although rarely enforced, the fear of this ritual humiliation kept most sellers honest, or at least dishonest in subtler ways. The oath complete, your ASP-NAMA was inked with a small phrase in Persian, Rast Bash, meaning walk straight. Feeding the beast, fodder economics and stable logistics. Your new horse is now legally yours, but that means more than just the right to ride it, means the duty to feed. In 13th century Central Asia, feeding a horse wasn't as simple as leading it to grass. Urban horses were primarily grain-fed. Hay was too bulky to transport in quantity, and open pasture within city walls was limited. You now faced daily costs. Grain, barley and millet were standard, wheat reserved for elite animals. Chaff provided roughage, often mixed with crushed date pits. Salt licks. Yes, again salt was added to stimulate thirst and maintain mineral balance. Clean water, often charged by the bucket in dry seasons. Local feed vendors operated from shaded stalls around the horse yard. They sold rations in pre-measured bundles, often marked with twine patterns indicating quantity and cost. A medium-sized horse might consume 8–10 kg of feed daily, costing about 1/3 of a tanka. That might not sound like much until you realize the average laborer's pay was 1 tanka per week. It's no wonder, then, that many horse owners partnered with others. Shared horse ownership, called Shurikat al-Asp, allowed multiple buyers to split both cost and usage. Each partner received a ride share token, often a wooden slip burned with their seal. The horse didn't know it belonged to 5 people, but the clerks did. Medical matters and the farrier's corner. Before departure, your horse required a veterinary inspection. You took it to the Nak al-Asp, the official farrier surgeon, who examined the hooves for splits, tested the eyes for cloudiness, and gently tugged the tail to observe pain response. If the horse passed, you received a stamped sihatab or health slip, valid for 30 days. If not, you faced a choice: delay travel and rest the animal, or sell it forward, usually at a loss, to one of the Asbai Karadaren, or problem horse buyers, who specialized in flipping sick or wild horses to regional garrisons at reduced rates. Most buyers chose rest. The farrier also offered services. Shoeing, using iron nails and flat plates, luxury option, or hemp-wrapped hooves, budget option. Hoof trimming, with curved blades and ruffles. Herbal tonics, said to strengthen lungs and cool the blood. These tonics were brewed from mulberry bark, dried rose, and oddly enough powdered fish scale. Their efficacy was debated even then. Thieves, bribery, and animal insurance. Your horse, now well fed and inspected, was still at risk. Horse theft was common particularly for well-documented animals, since their quality was proven. Bukhara's Nye Watch Registry offered an early form of animal insurance. For a small fee, usually 1 tanka per month, you could register your horse's description with city patrols. In return, if the animal was stolen and recovered, it would be returned to you, minus a retrieval gratitude fee. If the horse was not recovered, you received a formal letter ashknama, or letter of grief, that could be presented to tax officials to lower your levy. Emotional closure, bureaucratic forgiveness. More enterprising merchants hired guards boys on foot with short sticks, or men with bows who slept near the stable posts. A quiet, lucrative side business also thrived: horse branding forgery. Some scribes, for a price, would alter your brand sketch or change your horse's A by sanding the teeth. This could help dodge travel restrictions or taxes, but it was illegal and harshly punished if discovered. Mounting up, riding permits and first steps. If you planned to ride your horse out of the city, rather than hire a handler, you needed a rukhsatai safar, a rider's permit. This single parchment allowed travel beyond Bukhara's walls through specific gates and roads. It listed horse ownership ID, rider's name and city origin, expected direction of travel, travel purpose, trade, message, pilgrimage. This document protected you at checkpoints, but also tied you to your horse. If either vanished without explanation, you could be jailed on suspicion of smuggling, evasion, or banditry. Once the permit was granted, you were blessed by a stable clerk who recited, "Let your saddle carry weight but not regret." You mounted up, usually awkwardly, especially if you were new. Horse mounting styles varied. Step mount, leap from the right with minimal stirrup use. Persian mount, use a helper or block left side. Merchant mount, saddle bags first, then rider, often with assistance. You adjusted your seat, you squinted at the road ahead, the gate loomed. Unresolved thought. As you pass through the city gates, a newly purchased horse beneath you, you wonder if ownership truly means control. The documents say it's yours. The clerks say it's yours. The seller has walked away. But the horse doesn't care about ownership. It cares about food, footing, and your hands on the reins. And somewhere beyond this gate, a road waits to test whether you own this horse or whether, like so many before you, it is the horse who owns your journey. You've made your purchase. The horse beneath you responds to your shifting weight with a flick of its ears and a wary stomp. The city of Bukhara is now behind you, fading into the rising heat haze of the steppe. You have the papers, the brand, the oath. But the story of a horse deal in the 13th century didn't always end with the buyer riding off into the historical sunset. Sometimes, it unraveled slowly through accidents, disputes, or the grinding forces of legalism and imperial logistics. In this final section, we explore the journey beyond the city walls where travel, taxation, and unexpected consequences waited for even the most careful buyer. The toll that isn't a toll. Within just a few hours of leaving Bukhara, you encounter your first checkpoint, or Markazai Murer. It's a low, half-stone structure with a wooden shade over the front, manned by 2 Mongol-appointed clerks and a single guard chewing dried plum. They ask for 3 things: your asbnama, proof of horse ownership; your rukhsatai safar, travel permit; a hoof stamp fee, a minor, unofficial payment to mark your horse's hooves with dyed clay. This stamp is not recorded in any scrolls. It's applied with a brush and wears off in days, and yet refusal marks you as difficult. You pay the small bribe. The clerk, without smiling, nods and waves you through. This sort of toll was not unusual. While the Mongol Empire had formal postal and trade policies, local administrators often developed their own procedural customs. These weren't laws, but they were obeyed because to challenge them meant delays, interrogations, or worse, being required to prove the horse's legitimacy again, which involved going all the way back to Bukhara. When a horse refuses to walk, your horse, freshly acquired and still unfamiliar with your riding cues, stops mid-path near a watering ditch. Nothing is visibly wrong. No limp, no sign of illness, but it will not move forward. This is not uncommon. Horses used in salt caravans were sometimes trained to stop at certain scent markers, places associated with food, rest, or previous stabling. It can take days to retrain such behavior. You dismount, lead the horse by the reins. It follows reluctantly. Eventually, after 3 attempts and a quiet curse at the distant Fergana handlers who raised it, you move on. This moment illustrates an overlooked truth of medieval logistics. Animal temperament shaped travel routes as much as terrain or weather. One mule's stubbornness might reroute an entire caravan. One horse's fear of bridges might force a merchant onto a longer trail. These were not heroic obstacles, they were just slow. Accusations, arbitration, and the traveling court. 3 days into your journey, you reach a small river crossing near a village called Gavanak. Another rider, a merchant of dried figs, claims your horse looks familiar, too familiar. That horse, he says, was stolen last month from my cousin's stable in Termiz. You deny it. You produce your aspnama, but so does he. His document oddly bears a different brand burned faintly on the opposite flank. Now, a dispute. In the Mongol-controlled regions, itinerant arbitration courts existed for precisely this reason. A magistrate known as a Hakim-i-Safar would hold court every 10 days at rotating locations, resolving trade and ownership disputes. You're lucky. One is due to arrive at Gavanak tomorrow. The next day, under a fig tree, your case is heard. You present your papers. The fig merchant presents his witness. A local farrier is brought in to inspect the brand. After several hours of testimony, the Hakim rules. The brand you carry is newer, but your document is older. The fig merchant's cousin had likely doctored the older brand to fake theft and collect on insurance from Bukhara's night registry. The case is dismissed, but the fig merchant remains angry. You ride away with your horse, but your name is now whispered at tea stalls along the route. When the Empire reclaims what you bought. 2 weeks later, at a larger trade station near Merv, you receive unexpected news. Your horse has been requisitioned. You show your papers again, frustrated, but the requisition is legal. A postal shortage in the region has led the local Yam overseer to claim privately owned horses under a standing imperial edict known as Rafi Hajat al-Yam, the relief of the post. You are compensated, technically. A slip of stamped parchment promises 18 tankas, your original purchase price, to be collected at the tax office in bulk within 90 days. You are also given a replacement horse. It's older, shorter, a little limpy. You ride on, sullen. The clerks note your dissatisfaction. One of them smiles and says, "It is not the horse that matters. It is that you now know how to buy one." The economics of loss. So what happens to your 18 tankas? Nothing unless you make it to bulk. But that office is 11 days off route, and it has its own queues. Most merchants never collected their requisition compensation. They sold the parchment at a discount to traveling scribes who traded in debts. These debt notes, called faramini nagdi, could be sold for 10 or 12 tankas, depending on paper condition and the current wait time at bulk. In essence, you were paid for your horse, just not in cash. That parchment might travel farther than your horse ever did. And yet you try again. At the next caravan town, Sarax, you enter a smaller horse yard, fewer sellers, less fanfare. A crooked sign carved into mud brick reads, "We do not guarantee obedience, only movement." You look at a stout gelding with a dull coat and tired eyes. The price is fair. The broker is half asleep. The paperwork is short. You pay, no bargaining, no test ride. You know what you're getting, a maybe horse. You saddle up, the animal moves forward, slowly, but it moves. And that is enough for now. The cultural weight of a failed horse purchase. Throughout Central Asia in the 13th century, a failed horse deal was not seen as personal incompetence. It was part of the broader economy of uncertainty. Horses were like weather, predictable in pattern but erratic in detail. Mongol folk sayings at the time reflect this mindset. The saddle is yours, the journey is the horse. A seller's truth is strongest before breakfast. Every third horse dreams of running backward. But these weren't just jokes, they were survival strategies. Humor and resignation softened the edges of economic risk. Horse buyers rarely gave up. They bought again and again because travel was essential. And in a world of distances, the horse was the vehicle of dignity, whether it was healthy, broken, or swapped out mid-route. Final reflection: value measured in movement. In the end, you may wonder, was the horse worth it? You bought it with effort, lost it to bureaucracy, replaced it with something older and weaker. You were nearly accused of theft. You stood before a traveling judge. You paid unofficial tolls and read false brands and swallowed vinegar tea beside your new steed. But still you moved forward. That is the lesson of horse buying in Bukhara. Not to find the perfect animal, not to win the market, but to participate in a shared system of patience, friction, and persistence. Your story, like so many others, is not remembered in epic verse or grand mosaics, but somewhere, on a brittle scroll in a forgotten city office, your name and a horse brand still sit side by side. In movement, you existed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Story 3. A merchant's lunch in Kashgar. The sun is almost directly overhead, and the narrow alleys of Kashgar are thick with the smell of grilled mutton, damp cloth, and dusty trade goods. This is the 13th century, and Kashgar, one of the Silk Road's oldest trading cities, is a loud, layered place. Part Uyghur town, part Mongol garrison, part Sufi pilgrimage stop. You are a merchant today, not a rich one, not poor either. You carry iron tools and goatskin sacks of pickled garlic from Fergana, hopping to trade for paper and silk in the eastern stalls. You've done well enough this morning to earn the right to stop and eat. It's lunchtime. And that means more than food. It means politics of posture, survival through routine, and nourishment served with a side of caution. What lunch meant in a merchant's world. To a traveling merchant, lunch was not just a meal. It was a daily checkpoint. It marked whether your trade was going well, whether your route was safe, and whether the local clerks were likely to let you pass without another inspection. There were 3 tiers of lunch options in Kashgar. Caravan courtyards, shared meals in dusty hostel pens for travelers with no local contacts. Cheap, often communal, and watched closely by clerks or soldiers. Tea taverns, simple eateries tucked into side streets. Known for strong fermented drinks, simple bread, and moderate discretion. Indoor merchants' houses, private homes with paid lunches. Accessible by invitation or personal recommendation only. Quiet, clean, more paperwork but safer deals. Today you head for the second kind. A tea tavern near the Dye Market, known by a white cloth tied above its doorpost. It has no name, just a long clay bench, a steam pit, and the clatter of bowls. The menu, what merchants actually ate. Despite legends of exotic feasts on the Silk Road, the average merchant's lunch was humble and utilitarian. In Kashgar, a standard meal in 1275 might include flatbread naan, baked fresh each morning, stamped with geometric patterns and flecked with onion seed or salt. Broth ash, made from lamb bones, turnip peel, and whatever herbs were cheapest, served hot in shallow ceramic bowls. Pickled radish or garlic, sharp, salty, and meant to wake up the tongue. Dried apricots or dates, if business had been good that day. Fermented mare's milk, chimes, or barley tea, depending on your digestion and dignity. Meat was not guaranteed. It was a luxury. Most broth was flavored with scraps and thickened with grain or chickpea flour. Cutlery was optional. Most diners used fingers, scooping with bread or slurping directly. A clean sleeve was a napkin. A quiet burp was considered good manners, acknowledging the cook's effort. The tavern as a neutral zone. The tea tavern you sit in is full, but not crowded. Two Mongol soldiers lean over bowls in one corner, sleeves rolled up. A Persian scribe reads from a ledger while his spoon drips lazily onto the page. A Turkic woman in trade robes, likely selling dyed cloth, sits near the wall, scanning the entrance with quiet calculation. No one speaks loudly. Taverns were considered semi-neutral spaces on the Silk Road. Politics, even violent grudges, were temporarily suspended during meals. Kashgar enforced this with informal lunch amnesties, unwritten rules respected by most. No official inspections between the second and third shadow lengths, roughly noon to 1:30 p.m. No arrests during a seated meal, unless summoned by a magistrate. No weapon drawing inside eating houses without immediate cause. These rules weren't moral, they were logistical. Lunch was when tempers cooled, bribes were passed discreetly, and small debts were settled. Who cooked? The hidden workers of trade cuisine. The woman behind the fire pit is likely Uyghur. Her hands are calloused, her apron a checkerboard of past meals. She doesn't speak unless necessary. Her job is not service, it is stability. To feed travelers without gossip, to remember faces but not names. Cooks in Kashgar were a trade guild unto themselves. They bought ingredients at dawn, cooked until the second prayer call, then cleaned and closed by mid-afternoon. Each cook had to register with a local quality clerk, a position often inherited, whose only job was to check pot cleanliness and oil reuse. If the clerk found fault, the tavern was marked with chalk. 3 chalk marks in a month and your fire pit was dismantled by soldiers. Quiet, efficient, boring, but effective. Conversations over lunch. Lunch was also when information traveled. Not loudly, not obviously, but a tilt of the head, a muttered word, or the simple decision to sit near someone often carried meaning. Some typical topics. The Western checkpoint has a new scribe. He likes soft coins. A merchant from Cotton arrived with cracked jade sheep. The governor's nephew is collecting horses. Avoid the yard today. You listen more than you speak. This is not the time to brag about your trade. Everyone here is evaluating you as a competitor, threat, or opportunity. One man beside you, an Armenian trader by the look of his sash, whispers in passable Persian. Don't eat the broth today. There's too much bone. Go dry and drink later. It's not kindness, it's a test. You nod and break your bread instead. Currency, calculations, and what lunch cost. Lunch in 1275 Kashgar might cost 2 copper fulis for bread and broth, 3-4 fulis with fruit or a sweet drink, 6 fulis for a full tray, usually split between 2 or 3 travelers. This was affordable but cumulative. Most merchants carried their meal budgets as knotted strings of coins or tally beads. Some even used carved tokens pre-approved by a local money changer, redeemable only at certain stalls. Clerks from trade guilds occasionally dined at the same taverns, noting who paid in full and who tried to delay. These observations shaped a merchant's invisible trust score, unwritten, unspoken, but very real. A man who consistently paid a coin late was less likely to receive good caravan rates or favorable exchange at the paper stall. Your payment today, on time, 2 fulis, smooth-edged and warm from your pouch. The cook nods once, a subtle record made. Lunch interrupted, the silent inspection. Sometimes lunch was disrupted. Today, just as your tea cools, a minor official enters, robes creased, mustache stiff, eyes scanning. He doesn't speak. He walks between the tables, pausing now and then to glance at satchels or check the edges of permits tucked under bowls. He is a Marquez nigger, a market observer. His presence alone is enough to end conversations, not because he'll arrest you, but because his job is to listen quietly. He files small reports at day's end. Most are ignored. A few are passed up the chain. You make no eye contact. You finish your bread. The woman beside you, still scanning the entrance, scratches her head in a deliberate motion. 3 fingers once across the right temple. A silent warning. You nod, even though you don't know what it means, because in a place like this, acknowledgement is safer than ignorance. Unresolved thought. Your meal is finished. The bowl is empty. Your hands smell of salt and steam. You stand, brush the crumbs from your robe, and nod once to the cook as you leave. It was an ordinary lunch. No threats, no poison, no lost trade secrets. But as you step back into the glare of Kashgar's mid-afternoon sun, you wonder. How many lives' entire histories even have turned not on battlefields, but on something as quiet as a meal shared between strangers? You're walking back toward your lodging in Kashgar's merchant quarter, the weight of lunch still warming your stomach. The bread was dry but hearty, the broth passable, nothing fancy. But now you're thinking differently. Because in this city, this node in the Mongol Empire's vast logistical web, lunch isn't just food, it's leverage. And you've just been invited to a second meal. This one will not be served in a tea tavern. It will not be listed in a ledger or remembered by the public. It is a mid-afternoon sit-down inside a modest but walled courtyard near the olive cellars. You don't know what's being offered or why, but you said yes. Because on the Silk Road, the second meal was rarely about hunger. It was about business. The midday meeting meal. The second lunch, sometimes called nashai kamash, the quiet meal, was where real trade began. While markets bustled with performative haggling, it was in these shaded meetings, surrounded by tea, lentils, and flatbread, where trust was measured, tested, and, if possible, bought. You're seated under a woven canopy in the home of a merchant named Usted Joran, a silk broker known to deal in fine paper from Dali and occasionally in horses when politics allow. He's older than you, missing 2 fingers, and has one eye permanently squinted reputedly from a boiling ink accident. He gestures you to sit beside a small tray of spiced lentil cakes, dried plums in vinegar, a bowl of shira, barley drink thickened with goat milk, a barely warm stew with chickpeas and tendon. This is more food than you expected, but it's not generosity, it's a test of conduct. Eating etiquette as negotiation. In Kashgar, the way you ate mattered. It was watched, not just by your host, but often by a servant or scribe in the room pretending to pour tea. Some of the unwritten rules of etiquette during trade meals included: never eat the last item on a shared plate unless invited 3 times. Avoid dripping or loud chewing, seen as a sign of lack of restraint. Sip before speaking. Only fools begin a business pitch before the host swallows his first bite. Don't compliment the cook. Compliments suggest you want something. Never ask for salt, it implies the food is lacking. These weren't just habits, they were tests of attention. If you couldn't navigate a shared meal, what business did you have navigating multi-region trade? You eat modestly, nod when appropriate, and leave half a lentil cake untouched. Usted Joran, after a long slurp of shira, finally speaks. The garlic you carry, where is it packed? And just like that, the meal becomes negotiation. The hidden commerce of food. Garlic in this context is not just a foodstuff, it's a signal. Your cargo pickled garlic, cured in vinegar and packed in oiled goatskin, is a niche product in Kashgar, valued by healers, cooks, and traveling monks. But it spoils easily in heat, and doesn't travel well east into the wetter regions of the empire. So why is he asking? Because, as it turns out, Joran isn't interested in garlic at all. He's interested in your transport contacts. Specifically, whether your goods are being loaded into a Mongol-licensed freight caravan, or if you're using a smaller, private handler who might carry other items. Like silk, like sealed paper scrolls, like untaxed gems. This second lunch isn't about food or even garlic. It's about mapping your network. Quiet deals, loud implications. Here, how such exchanges typically unfolded. The merchant tests you. He'll ask indirect questions about your suppliers, your pace of travel, your familiarity with city gates. He's not checking facts. He's checking comfort. Fidgeting, vagueness, or false modesty can be taken as signs you're hiding something, or worse, incompetent. You make a passive offer. You might say something like, "My loaders prefer the west gate." It seems innocent, but it might signal you have access to guards who can be bribed, or that you avoid the Eastern Customs Office, known for unpredictable delays. A proxy suggests a favor. An assistant may later approach you at a well or food stall offering a trade route, a shared animal hire, or space in their next shipment. Accepting isn't dangerous, but it marks you as cooperative in unofficial logistics. Nothing is written down. The second lunch never ends with paper. Just a nod, a quiet agreement to meet again after sunset, or a hand placed briefly over the heart signaling that something was understood if not spoken. In your case, Joran simply offers, "If your garlic bags require shade, my courtyard is always cool by afternoon." You nod once, it's enough. The role of food in legal shielding. Food also served as legal camouflage. In the Mongol world, business done over a recorded meal had legal implications. If a scribe or witness noted the presence of trade talk at a meal, then certain agreements could be informally upheld under city regulation, particularly if a local elder or trade clerk could verify attendance. That's why this meal is served in private, with no scribe in the room, because the conversation you're having isn't happening. But should it be challenged later, say, if one of you is accused of smuggling or failure to deliver, local testimonies about who served what and who sat where could influence the outcome. So yes, even lentils could become legal defense. The watchers at the wall. Leaving Joran's house, you pass a familiar alley where city scribes often sit. They're not officials. They're watchers, men and women who observe the patterns of trade and movement, then sell that information to customs officers or rival traders. They never ask for coin. They wait for others to come to them. One of them raises a hand slightly as you pass. It's a woman with ink-stained fingertips and a cracked sandal. She speaks only one word. Cucumber. It's not a question, it's a signal. Cucumber in the slang of merchant espionage means unripe, don't buy yet. Perhaps referring to your garlic deal, perhaps something else. You nod slightly. You don't know if she's warning you or manipulating you. Either way, you'll skip the customs check at the East Gate today, just in case. The politics of sitting down. Throughout the Silk Road, the act of sitting for a meal held subtle power dynamics. A lower-ranked merchant would be expected to sit with his legs crossed, arms visible. A host would recline slightly to suggest control over the space. Sharing meat with someone of a different background, e.g., Turkic with Chinese, or Persian with Mongol, was considered a mild act of trust, a gesture of bridge building in trade diplomacy. Conversely, refusing food during a midday meal without illness or religious reason was considered an insult. You might as well accuse your host of poisoning you. This made second meals both valuable and dangerous. Sitting down was a kind of soft contract: I will not harm you, and I trust you will not harm me. Yet, unresolved thought. You leave the courtyard full, but not from food. The barley drink lingers at the back of your throat, sharp and sour. You glance at your satchel still sealed, garlic-heavy, untraded, and feel the invisible weight of a bargain not quite made, and a warning not quite understood. Later tonight, someone may offer you another plate, another deal, another question in the shape of hospitality. And you wonder, in this city of trade, who do we eat with because we trust them, and who do we trust simply because they've offered us food? Evening falls slowly over Kashgar. The sandstone walls take on a soft gold hue, and the last of the market cries echo through narrow streets. You're still walking, still chewing over your second lunch mentally, not physically. The barley drink has settled. The dried plums, tart and clinging to your molars, have left only a hint of vinegar on your breath. And now you're wondering, when is the next meal? And more importantly, with whom will you share it? Because on the Silk Road, meals weren't just moments of sustenance. They were intervals of trust, markers of status, and in their absence they left more than an empty belly. They left questions. Food as forecast. What you ate meant what you'd become. In Kashgar and beyond, the food you ate at lunch hinted at what kind of trader you were becoming. A quiet status system emerged not through gold, but through ingredients. Some examples. Pickled garlic signaled northern trade ties. It didn't travel well eastward, so carrying it marked you as a Fergana feeder, a slow-moving merchant, focused on regional trade. Dried apricots or walnut oil cakes, likely a connection to the Pamir roots and access to colder passes. Fresh noodles or mung bean dishes suggested you'd done business with Chinese merchants in the East, requiring trust, paper permits, and often shared accommodations. And then there was rice. In Kashgar, rice was rare. It didn't grow well here, and importing it was expensive. Eating a rice dish in public, especially during lunch, was a quiet declaration. I trade with the East. I deal in paper. I'm trusted enough to carry scrolls. You haven't eaten rice in 2 seasons. The space between meals. Between lunch and dinner, there was no formal meal, but there were rituals of waiting. Tea sipped at gate checkpoints. A handful of raisins chewed while inspecting camel tack. Warm water flavored with cinnamon bark near merchant rest houses. These weren't meals. They were bridges, tiny comforts meant to keep hunger from becoming distraction. And sometimes, a meal was denied on purpose. In the trade districts of Kashgar, merchants occasionally refused dinner invitations to signal a subtle change in alliances. A skipped meal could mean, "I'm considering a better deal." Your payment was late. I heard what you said in the dye market. Food, once a symbol of welcome, could be weaponized through its absence. Hungry clerks and starving power. Not everyone in Kashgar was well fed. For every cautious garlic seller or silk negotiator, there were clerks, scribes, and errand boys who lived on crusts and broth tails. Many clerks in the customs offices subsisted on government rice, rations, a small bowl in the morning, and a piece of naan in the evening, issued through a rotating meal ticket. Those denied food as punishment were not beaten. They were simply ignored at dinner. To be denied the communal tray was to be erased socially. A clerk might still work, still write, but no one would greet him. No one would speak his name until a merchant brought him food, offered in silence, hand over heart, once trust was rebuilt. It was called restoring the spoon. The merchant who ate alone. One story often passed between traders in Kashgar was of a man named Saif al-Kandi, a merchant of hard candies from the far west who ate every lunch alone for 13 years. He refused invitations, paid double for private meals, ate silently in empty courtyards. Some said he feared poisoning. Others believed he carried shame from a lost caravan, a rumor of betrayal near Samarkand that left 4 men dead and 1 deal broken. But the truth, according to the tea seller who fed him daily, was simpler. He said talking made the food spoil in his mouth. Still, when Saif died, 3 men attended his funeral. Each carried a wrapped meal and placed it beside his grave, not as an offering but as forgiveness. Even in death, a merchant's meals lingered in memory. Dinner as conclusion or rejection. You're invited again, this time to a dinner gathering of junior merchants in a garden outside the city. No formal deal, just lentil stew, chickpea mash, boiled eggs, and the hope of relaxed company. But you decline. Not rudely, you say your stomach aches, you smile, you offer a fig. Because tonight you need distance. The second lunch rattled you. Joran's offer wasn't just about garlic. It was about stepping into a deeper web, one that might carry profit, yes, but also expectations, entanglements, obligations. A free lunch was never free, a second lunch even less so. So you sit alone on your mat, eat cold bread, drink warm water. You are not hungry exactly, but you are thinking. The ghost meals. Across the city, other meals are ending. Some go unnoticed. A mule driver and his son share leftover barley mash on a stable roof. 2 women salt fish behind a dye vat, trading rumors in place of coin. A young scholar eats quietly from a pot of porridge, his only company a candle and 3 half-finished scrolls. These meals are not recorded, but they shaped routes, prices, and decisions just as much as any royal edict. A dropped bowl could delay a shipment. A poisoned plum could trigger a feud. A missed meal might push a man to accept a poor trade he otherwise wouldn't. The ghost meals of the Silk Road, eaten in silence, in shame, or in solitude, still whispered in the ledgers, curled in ink stains, scattered in ledger margins. Final reflection, the slow power of a meal. Tomorrow you will eat again, likely in the same tavern, likely the same bread, the same broth. And you'll scan the room again. Because lunch, you now understand, is not a pause in your journey, it is the journey. It's where danger shifts into familiarity, where decisions simmer beneath the soup, where names are traded like figs and trust is tested with crumbs. The Mongol Empire may have ruled with horses and arrows, but the merchants of Kashgar ruled with lentils and tea. To eat is to survive. To sit is to declare intention. To leave a meal unfinished is sometimes the loudest thing you can do. Story 4. The siege that took forever, Xianyang and the Mongols. You are standing just outside the city of Xianyang in southern China. The year is 1267, and the Mongol Empire has begun its longest, dullest, and most consequential siege. Forget fireballs, charging cavalry, and heroic escapes. That isn't this story. This is the story of tents pitched in mud for 6 years, of ropes pulled, of supply lines drawn across rivers like veins, of soldiers sharpening the same spear day after day without ever using it, and of a city that didn't burn but endured. This is the siege that taught the Mongols patience. This is the siege that changed China. Xianyang, the linchpin no one could afford to lose. Xianyang sat along the Han River, a branch of the Yangtze. Together with its twin city Fancheng, just across the river, it formed a barrier between Mongol-held northern China and Song dynasty-controlled South China. It wasn't the largest city, or the richest, but it was a choke point, the lock on a door that the Mongols wanted very badly to open. Why? Because all roads south toward the fertile plains, supply chains, and rice-producing heartlands of the Song ran through Xianyang. Kublai Khan, already declared Great Khan, was determined to complete what Genghis had started, the full conquest of China, but Xianyang stood in the way, and the Song dynasty knew it. So they fortified, they dug, they built floating bridges, reinforced walls, and a network of signal towers that could relay messages for hundreds of kilometers. And then they waited. The beginning of boredom, the siege commences. The Mongols arrived in late 1267 with a plan that looked deceptively simple. Surround the city. cut off supplies, wait for surrender. But Xiangyang didn't follow the plan. The Song commanders had stocked years' worth of rice, dried fish, salted greens, and even fermented tofu. They had water from the river. The city was prepared not for attack, but for existence under pressure. So began what one Mongol chronicler called the Siege of Breathing Walls. Siege tactics, from thunder to thirst. The Mongols were not new to sieges. They had conquered the Khwarezmian Empire, the cities of the Russian principalities, and chunks of Persia with terrifying speed. But Chinese fortress cities were different. Wall height. Xiangyang's walls were over 40 feet tall, made of rammed earth and brick. Wall width, wide enough for 4 horses to ride abreast along the top. Inner compounds. If the outer wall fell, the defenders would fall back to inner fortresses, creating layers of resistance. Water defense. The Han River supplied both cities and could not be easily blocked. The Mongols tried. Tunneling. Chinese defenders simply flooded the tunnels. Flaming carts, rolled back downhill by defenders with wet claws. Starvation. Song supply tunnels under the river rendered this slow and ineffective. Noise, gongs, horns, drums, until even the Mongol horses stopped reacting. Each failed. So the Mongols did what few expected. They dug in. Life in the Mongol siege camps. To most soldiers, this wasn't war. It was camping with structure. Each man lived in a felt tent or mud lean-to. Daily routines included cooking millet porridge, sharpening weapons they wouldn't use, collecting firewood, writing letters, or, for the illiterate, paying a scribe to do it. For soldiers stationed along the river banks, duties became even more tedious. Checking paddle boats for leaks, tying down supply logs, marking flood water levels on wooden poles. A Mongol officer named Kirk reportedly kept a logbook that included entries like, Day 142, rice flour moldy, weather hot, Fancheng's flags unchanged. That was it. Day after day, month after month, men watched from trenches as nothing happened, except everything was happening just slowly. The Song's quiet defiance. Inside Xiangyang, the Song dynasty soldiers also endured a drawn-out existence. Children grew older, harvests were gathered and stored, small weddings were performed in basements under the boom of distant catapults. Citizens formed rotation squads, 10-day shifts on the wall, then back to domestic life. The defenders used signal kites to communicate with Fancheng across the river. They built counterweight pulley systems to drop supplies down hidden shafts. They made noise on purpose, drumming loudly during Mongol patrols to hide repair work. They wrote taunts on arrows, firing them into the enemy trenches. This city is full, your stomach is not. The endless games of siege diplomacy. During the early years of the siege, ambassadors came and went, always under flags of truce, always with nothing to show for it. Kublai Khan offered high positions to Song generals. He promised pardons, silk, a chance to serve in the Yuan court. They declined. Sometimes just to keep up appearances, the two sides would arrange token exchanges, books, letters, even food. One document from 1269 references a small cask of pickled mustard greens sent from Xiangyang to the Mongol camp as an offering of taste. The Mongols sent dried dates in return. No one trusted them. But they were eaten anyway. Because the longer the siege lasted, the more food became not just fuel but diplomacy. Unresolved thought. You walk the riverbank under moonlight. The flags of Xiangyang still flutter across the water, calm and unconcerned. The siege has not broken the city, not yet. And as you return to camp, rice bowl in hand, you begin to wonder. In a war of patience, who wins, the one who holds longest or the one who changes least? It is now the year 1271, 4 years into the siege. You are still outside Xianyang, and nothing has changed, and yet everything has. The Mongols have built supply routes that stretch hundreds of kilometers. The Song defenders continue to grow their own vegetables inside the city. Both sides have grown weary, but neither has broken. And then quietly something does change. Two engineers arrive. Not Chinese, not Mongol, but foreign, Westerners, brought in to solve what horse archers and flaming carts could not. The siege of Xianyang is about to enter its second phase, one shaped not by bravery, but by physics, not by glory, but by geometry, gravity, and gunpowder. The arrival of the Frankish engineers. Kublai Khan, frustrated by the stalemate, turns to a pair of men described in Chinese and Persian sources as Muslim foreigners of the Western Seas. Their names are lost to us, but records from the Jami al-Tawarik and Yuan documents suggest they were likely from the Middle East, possibly from Syria or Persia, brought east by Mongol networks of global recruitment. They are often referred to as Ismail and al-Afridi in secondary sources, though this may be fictional or symbolic. Their job was clear: break the walls that have not bent. And their method, a siege weapon never before seen in China, the counterweight trebuchet. Trebuchet, the math of destruction. The Mongols had used catapults before. So had the Chinese. But these new trebuchets, called hui hui pao, Muslim catapults, could throw stones 10 times heavier than traditional siege engines, with greater accuracy and velocity. The core innovation was the counterweight, a massive wooden box filled with rocks or earth, suspended on one end of the throwing arm. When released, the weight swung downward, hurling the projectile from the other end with terrifying force. Construction began near Fancheng. It took months, hundreds of trees, and precise calculations. The engineers supervised every step, no shortcuts. When the trebuchets were finished, there were likely two, each had a crew of 250 men. Their first test came on a cold morning. They launched a 200 kg stone straight into Xianyang's outer wall. The impact was described by a Mongol chronicler as like the sky had been struck by the earth. The psychological war begins. The damage was physical, but the fear was mental. For 4 years, the defenders had learned the Mongols' rhythms, their catapults, manageable, their arrows, loud but familiar. But these trebuchets were alien. Each shot sounded like a mountain collapsing. Stones smashed battlements. Buildings behind the walls shattered from debris and vibrations. The Song defenders built wooden frames to absorb the hits. They padded walls with straw bales and hung cloth curtains to slow shrapnel, but the fear spread. Children stopped sleeping. Even the war drums grew quieter. Still, the city did not fall. Because what the Mongols gained in power, they lost in patience. Logistics of lethargy, feeding a siege. As the siege stretched into its 5th year, the question of supply became more urgent than strategy. Every soldier in the Mongol camp required 2-3 jin approx. 1.5 kg of grain per day, firewood or dried dung for cooking, animal fodder for horses and mules, salt, vinegar, and fermented vegetables to prevent scurvy. These supplies were not sourced locally. They came from the north, through a supply line over 1,000 kilometers long, involving warehouses near Beijing, river barges on the Yellow River, porters carrying sealed jars on foot. Mongol quartermasters created rotating wagon trains, each time to arrive every 12 days. This required staggering precision, especially during monsoon season when roads washed out and banditry increased. One winter, records show 14 carts of vinegar delayed by snow, resulting in 90 cases of mouth rot among troops. Siege warfare by this point was not just combat. It was logistics versus resilience. Inside Xianyang, the art of surviving forever. The Song defenders continued to adapt. They harvested rainwater in rooftop urns, grew radish and turnip greens in courtyard gardens. A system of underground wind tunnels allowed fresh air circulation, keeping grain stores dry. Boredom, not hunger, became the enemy. Song generals issued mental tasks to keep morale. Memory competitions, calligraphy contests, wall repair speed drills, training pet crows to retrieve arrows with modest success. Each day survived was a small victory. Each trebuchet strike that failed to breach the wall was another reason to hope. And hope, the defenders knew, was more dangerous to the Mongols than fire. A letter that changed everything. In 1272, a captured Mongol scout was found to be carrying a letter, a plea from inside Xianyang. Our strength declines, the city's lungs grow thin. The message was addressed to the Song court in Linen, modern Hangzhou, asking for more support. But by now, the court was growing distant politically and emotionally. Kublai Khan's offers of surrender terms seemed increasingly rational to many in power. By late 1272, reinforcement orders stalled. Supply routes to Xianyang were left undefended. In 1273, the Mongols finally struck. Unresolved thought. You're watching from a hill as another stone crashes into the city's north wall. You've stopped flinching. The sound is routine now, just part of the day's rhythm. And yet this time dust rises differently. There's a gap, not wide, not deep, but new. Is this the beginning of the end, or just another crack the city will patch with its resolve? You sip your broth, still hot from the shared kettle, and wonder, is it the first stone that wins a siege, or the one that finally convinces the defenders that time is no longer on their side? By early 1273, the siege of Xianyang had entered its 6th year. 6 years of rain-soaked trenches, broken paddles, stone-launched walls, and diplomatic silence. 6 years of shouting across rivers, sealing rice in clay pots, and watching the seasons come and go like indifferent couriers. It wasn't supposed to last this long. But in the end, the city didn't fall in a blaze of glory. It didn't collapse under fire, nor did its defenders betray it in a storm of cowardice. Xianyang fell because someone finally decided to stop standing. This is the story of how a city surrendered not with a scream, but with a signature. The breach that broke the pattern. In early January 1273, one of the new trebuchets, positioned across the Han River on the Fancheng side, launched a particularly well-aimed stone. It struck a corner tower, already weakened by frost and repeated vibration. The tower cracked, then fell not inward but outward, tumbling down into the trench with a dull, wet sound that echoed through both camps. It was the first major structural failure since the siege began. The breach wasn't wide enough to rush troops through, not yet, but it was enough to signal something worse. The city was not unbreakable. From the Mongol side there was no cheer, only the quiet grinding of logistics. Stones were counted, ropes adjusted, and a new firing schedule was issued. The Song defenders, watching from within, said nothing. But the songs that used to play on wind chimes, those rhythmic tunes plucked to confuse Mongol scouts, stopped that night. Fancheng falls. 2 weeks later, in February 1273, the smaller twin city across the river Fancheng finally fell. It had endured almost as long as Xianyang, but had fewer internal stores and less wall reinforcement. Once its gates were breached, the Mongols took it methodically, no slaughter, just occupation and administration. Surviving Song officials were catalogued, not killed. This was Kublai Khan's version of modern conquest: eliminate resistance, then incorporate the rest. From the towers of Xianyang, the defenders could see Mongol banners flying across the river. It was a psychological blow. And it meant something far worse. The Song supply tunnels, which had run under the river, were now compromised. Xianyang's ability to refresh its grain and messages from the south had been cut off. The quiet of the walls. The next 40 days were described in later chronicles as days of diminished voice. Inside Xianyang, food became precious. Rats were no longer killed, they were trapped, fattened, and eaten. The garrison began reducing guard rotations. No one had the strength to maintain full shifts. The upper levels of the towers were abandoned. It was too dangerous, too cold, and too exposed. Morale didn't collapse. It thinned like watered-down soup. Meanwhile, the Mongols did what they always did best. They documented everything. Daily logs from the besieging camp recorded. Wind speed for trebuchet calibration. Night temperatures for estimating frost damage on city walls. Visible human activity on the ramparts. River debris indicating internal waste disposal or lack thereof. Siege warfare had become science. And slowly, Xianyang was becoming less a fortress and more a measurement. The letters that ended it. In March 1273, the lead song general inside Xianyang, Lu Wenhuan, sent a messenger out under white flag. The message was passed along 5 hands before reaching the Mongol field commander. It read, "The hawk does not leave the sky, the rabbit no longer runs. Shall we speak of new seasons?" This was a signal, couched in poetic form. Lu was ready to negotiate surrender. The Mongol reply came within hours, also in formal verse. "The wind changes, but the sky does not hate the tree. Come out with dignity. Bring the scrolls." The scrolls in question. City records, tax documents, civil rosters. The Mongols didn't just want the walls, they wanted the infrastructure of administration. Without it, Xianyang would be a husk. The terms of surrender. The final terms of surrender, delivered in early April 1273, were: no massacre of citizens. Military officers would be disarmed, not executed. All song banners would be surrendered publicly and replaced with Yuan flags under ceremonial supervision. Mongol forces would occupy the city without looting. In exchange, the city gates would be opened, the records surrendered, and Lu Wenhuan would switch allegiance and serve in the Yuan administration. All this was agreed to. And on April 17, 1273, Xianyang opened its gates. There was no trumpet, no explosion, no fire. Just a dusty silence and the slow sound of boots crossing a bridge. What Xianyang meant. The fall of Xianyang changed everything. It allowed the Mongols direct access to the Yangtze River, opening the way to the south. It cut the Song dynasty's defensive line in half. It marked the first successful use of foreign engineering to tip the balance in Chinese warfare. And it proved that time, calculation, and logistics could defeat even the most prepared city. Within 6 years of Xianyang's surrender, the Mongols captured the Song capital. By 1279, the entire Song dynasty collapsed. It had begun, quietly, with a city that didn't fall apart, it fell in line. Final reflection, the weight of a siege without glory. Xianyang is rarely mentioned in great heroic epics. There was no last stand, no martyrdom, no single great general whose death turned the tide. And yet this siege may have been the most important military action in Kublai Khan's entire career. Because it taught the Mongols how to conquer the unconquerable, not with arrows, but with accountants. Not with horses, but with engineers and patience. Xianyang proved that endurance is not infinite. And that sometimes, the most boring parts of history, the years where nothing seems to happen, are the ones that decide how the centuries unfold. Story 5. Letters that took years to arrive. The papal envoys to Kublai Khan. The year is 1245, and you are not in China, not yet. You are in Lyon, in what is now southern France. The Pope Innocent IV has just received word of a people so fierce, so unstoppable, that European kings have begun praying for divine weather to stop them. The Mongols. They had ridden into Hungary like thunder and vanished like smoke. No one in Europe truly understood who they were, what they wanted, or whether they would come back. So the Pope, a man more comfortable with cathedrals than cavalry, does the only thing he can do. He writes a letter. Not just one letter, several. And he selects a few men, not soldiers, not envoys trained in Asian languages, but Franciscan friars to carry these messages across thousands of miles to a man called the Great Khan. This is not a story of success. This is not a story of diplomacy that changed the world. This is a story of travel delay and the slow-motion impact of unread ink on fatting parchment. The mission begins, the first letter to nowhere. The first letter, titled Cum non solum, since not only, is written in Latin and begins with the familiar weight of papal authority. It is intended to express dismay at the Mongol destruction in Europe, urge the Khan to stop his wars, invite him to convert to Christianity, offer the friendship of Christendom. What it does not include is maps, accurate names of Mongol leaders, any reason the Khan might care. Nevertheless, the Pope signs it with his seal and hands it to a friar named Giovanni de Pian del Carpin, an elderly man in poor health who has never been to Asia. His instructions are simple. Deliver this to the Great Khan and return with his reply. He departs in 1245. He returns in 1247. He is lucky to return at all. The journey, a walk measured in blisters. Giovanni's path is not straight. From France he passes through Bohemia, modern Czechia, Poland, where Mongol raids had occurred just a few years earlier, Kiev, still scorched from prior sackings, southern Russia, now part of the Mongol-controlled Golden Horde, across the Volga River, to Karakorum, the Mongol capital. This is a trip of over 5,000 miles. There are no regular roads, no postal service for foreign monks, no interpreters trained in both Latin and Mongolian. So Giovanni picks up languages as he goes. He sleeps on frozen ground. He eats boiled millet and mare's milk. His companion dies on the return trip. His feet crack in the cold. His documents are soaked and re-dried dozens of times. He is questioned at every checkpoint by Mongol guards who cannot read the Pope's seal and have never heard of Lion. And when he finally reaches the court of the Khan Guyuk, grandson of Genghis, he is received politely, even given food. But the response is not what the Pope had hoped. The reply, not an invitation but a demand. Guyuk Khan's reply is brief, and its tone is chillingly administrative. He essentially says, "You, the Pope, are a vassal who has not submitted. If you do not come to us in person and swear allegiance, you and your kings will be destroyed." It's signed, stamped, and given to Giovanni who, after a few weak attempts to clarify the terms, turns around and begins the long walk home. The letter reaches the Pope in 1247. By then, Guyuk is already dead. It had taken 2 years for the message to travel in either direction. No response is sent. But the letters don't stop. In 1253, the Pope tries again. This time, another Franciscan, William of Rubruck, is sent, not by the Pope directly, but by King Louis IX of France. His journey is similarly difficult and similarly ignored by history. Rubruck makes it all the way to the court of Mernk Khan, another grandson of Genghis. Mernk is courteous but confused. If your God is so powerful, why has he not protected your lands from us? Rubruck is not allowed to preach widely. His letters are translated poorly. No alliance is formed. He returns home and writes a long report describing Mongol customs, animals, diet, and diplomacy. It becomes one of the most valuable ethnographic records of the 13th century. But as a diplomatic mission, It accomplishes nothing. The speed of paper. Why did the missions fail? Partly because of distance. A letter from France to Karakoram could take 18-24 months one way. Longer if the roads were blocked by war, plague, or weather. Even longer if the recipient had died mid-journey. The idea of a negotiation was impossible. The sender and the receiver were trapped in different calendars, different languages, and different mental worlds. The Mongols saw themselves as universal sovereigns. Why would they negotiate with a bishop in a distant land? And the Europeans, lacking maps, misunderstood the structure of Mongol power. They often thought there was just one Khan, not realizing the empire was fracturing by the mid-1250s. So the letters kept arriving after events had already changed. History had already moved on. The letters as artifacts. And yet these papal letters survived. Some are still housed in archives in the Vatican and in museums across Europe. Their seals are cracked. Their Latin phrasing is formal to the point of obscurity. Their handwriting uneven ink smudged by cold fingers or dried too quickly in desert winds. Each letter is a time capsule of misunderstanding. A document written by a man who'd never seen Asia. Carried by a monk who'd never commanded troops. Delivered to a ruler who'd never seen a cathedral. And answered in a script no one in Rome could read. Unresolved thought. You are sitting in a dusty chamber somewhere in the Central Asian steppe, watching a Mongol scribe copy a reply to a letter written in a language he doesn't speak. The parchment will travel 6,000 miles by horseback and foot, over rivers and through bandit lands. By the time it arrives, the man who wrote the original may already be buried beneath a marble floor in France. And you ask yourself, was the message ever meant to be read or just sent? When William of Rubruck returned to Europe in 1255, his report contained hundreds of pages of detail. The taste of fermented mare's milk, the layout of Mongol cities, even the social ranking of falconers. But the one thing his report lacked was good news. There would be no alliance, no shared understanding, no agreement to convert. What he had instead was a pattern one repeated again and again. A Christian mission sent eastward. A dangerously long journey. A polite but pointed dismissal by Mongol rulers. A return to Europe bearing words that no one wanted to hear. Yet despite these failures, the West kept writing. Because paper, as it turns out, travels faster than understanding. The rebirth of Mongol power under Kublai. By the late 1250s, a new figure emerged in the East, Kublai Khan. Unlike his predecessors, Kublai was not just a warlord, he was a bureaucrat. He had advisors from Persia, scholars from China, and traders from Venice. His court was the most culturally mixed administration in the world. And so, when the papacy changed hands again, Innocent IV died. Followed by several others, Europe got curious again. Maybe this new Khan, this Kublai, would be different. Maybe he would listen. This time a new pope, Clement IV, considered writing once more. But the messages would now follow a more indirect route, not through Poland and the steppes, but through a different kind of missionary. A family of merchants. Enter the Polos, letters meet commerce. In 1260, two Venetian brothers, Niccolo and Maffei Polo, left Constantinople and traveled east on a trading journey. They had no political mission, no religious orders, just goods, silver, and the desire to reach China. What they found, however, was more than business. In 1266, after reaching the Mongol court, they were received by Kublai Khan himself. He was intrigued by these foreign visitors particularly because they came from lands he had only heard of by rumor. And so he gave them something unusual. A request. Kublai dictated a letter to the Pope, asking for 100 Christian scholars to be sent to his court. He even gave the brothers a paysa, a golden tablet granting them safe passage across Mongol lands. This was the first time in decades that a Mongol ruler had asked for something from the West. The Polos returned to Europe immediately with the Khan's letter in hand. The message that arrived too late again. By the time the Polos arrived in Rome, Clement IV was dead. The papacy was in turmoil. No pope would be elected for another 2 years. So the brothers waited. When a new pope was finally crowned, Gregory X, they delivered the letter, explained Kublay's interest in Christianity, and requested a return delegation. The pope agreed, sort of. He sent only 2 friars instead of 100, Niccolo of Vicenza and William of Tripoli. Both turned back almost immediately, citing war and disease on the road. Only the Polos continued the journey, this time bringing with them a teenaged Marco, Niccolo's son. Kublai Khan would never get the teachers he asked for. Instead, he got a storyteller. But that's a different story, one of exaggerated cities, golden pagodas, and crocodile-infested kingdoms. We will return to Marco Polo later in this series. For now, we remain focused on the slow, doomed diplomacy of papal ink. The papal-Mongol disconnect. Why did these missions fail? The misunderstanding ran deep on both sides. Western assumption, Mongol reality. The Khan seeks salvation, the Khan seeks submission. Christianity can be exported through letters. Mongol religion is inclusive but hierarchical. Diplomacy is about equals. Diplomacy is about hierarchy, who bows first. Mongol rulers often saw these letters as tributes, not negotiations. Declarations of loyalty, not invitations to friendship. Requests for mercy, not offers of religion. Papal messengers, by contrast, thought they were teaching, spreading the light of Christianity to a distant and curious land. The gap in expectation was enormous, and no number of Latin seals could bridge it. The response of the Mongols, politeness as policy. One remarkable trait of Mongol diplomacy was courtesy, even to enemies. Letters were often received respectfully, even if ignored. Diplomats were rarely executed, an anomaly in medieval politics. Messages were copied and stored in archives for decades. This allowed a strange illusion to persist in Europe. The Mongols are listening. In fact, they were often just waiting to see if the West would ever become part of their world. The final papal attempt. In 1305, a final letter was drafted, this time by Pope Clement V. He had heard rumors of a Christian Mongol prince in Persia, Ghazan Khan, who had converted to Islam but showed occasional favor to Christian advisors. Clement wrote to him, hoping for an alliance against the Mamluks in Egypt. Again, the letter was polite, formal, and full of religious idealism. And again, it arrived after Ghazan's death. No reply was sent. Europe once again wrote into the void. What the Mongols actually wanted. The Mongol Khans never demanded theology. What they wanted was maps, calendars, doctors and engineers, goldsmiths and masons, tribute and clarity. They were intensely practical. If you brought tools, you were welcome. If you brought prayers and parchments, they might listen, but they would not change policy. The papacy misunderstood this over and over again. The legacy of the letters. Though they achieved little diplomatically, the papal letters left behind a fascinating historical trail. They revealed how little Europe understood about Asia. They highlighted the difficulties of long-distance communication before modern empires. They created a foundation for future contact, including trade, science, and exploration. And they preserved, in their failure, a snapshot of a world just before the global age began. The ink dried. The messengers returned, mostly alive. And history moved on without them. Unresolved thought. You imagine a room in Avignon, where an archivist opens a box of scrolls letters sent to Kublai Khan, their seals unbroken, their edges crisp. And you wonder, did anyone ever read them? Or did they simply wait, like the senders, for a world that never arrived? By the time the last papal letters reached the Mongol court in the early 1300s, the world had already changed. The Mongol Empire, once a seamless sprawl from China to the Black Sea, had fractured into four khanates. Kublai Khan was dead. The Ilkhanate in Persia had converted to Islam. And the idea of a single great Khan, who might unify with Europe under one god, one law, and one banner was no longer even a fantasy. It was a footnote. But the letters kept coming, even as the routes grew more dangerous, even as the messages arrived too late, addressed to rulers already in the grave, even as the parchment yellowed before it could be translated. Because writing letters, it turns out, was easier than understanding. The last letters, the final attempts at communication between the papacy and the Mongol world, came not with grand declarations, but with polite exhaustion. In 1320, a small group of Dominican friars traveled east toward the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. They carried messages from Pope John XXII, hoping to convert some segment of the Mongol elite, especially after hearing rumors of Christian sympathies in isolated corners. Their journey was brief, poorly documented, and ended with silence. No replies survive. No conversions were recorded. Their names are barely remembered. It marked the end of nearly 80 years of papal attempts to reach across the steppes. A pause in the dust, the great interruption. There's something telling in what happened next. After decades of missionary energy, a great silence followed. Europe turned inward. The papacy moved to Avignon. The Black Death was on the horizon. Mongol power in China was nearing its end with the crumbling of the Yuan dynasty. By 1368, a new Chinese dynasty, the Ming, would rise and drive out the Mongols completely. And with it, the communication lines dried up. There were no more embassies from Lyon or Avignon. No friars crossing the Caspian with letters sealed in wax. Just memories stored in ecclesiastical records, labeled epistolae ad Tartaros. Letters to the Tatars. Unread. Unanswered. Unneeded. The forgotten archives. Today, several of the papal letters sent to the Mongols survive in European archives. They are stored in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, in collections at British and French universities, in digitized formats often unread for centuries. Some are still written in the Pope's own hand, with phrases like ad dominum magnificum Tartarorum, to the magnificent Lord of the Tartars. They are testaments not to success, but to longing. A longing for peace. A longing for order in a world that felt constantly threatened. A longing to control events far beyond the reach of armies or reason. These were not just diplomatic messages. They were acts of hope, wrapped in formal grammar and sent on the backs of animals. What remains? The value of a failed mission. Historians often ask whether these letters accomplished anything. On the surface, no. No conversion, no alliances, no treaties. But look more closely, and you find something else. 1. A record of world awareness. These letters show that medieval Europe, so often thought of as isolated, was aware of the wider world. It didn't understand it, but it knew it existed, and it wanted to connect. 2. Cross-cultural curiosity. While the messages themselves were often clumsy, they still represent an early effort at cross-cultural dialogue. Even when the dialogue failed, the intent to understand was there. 3. The beginning of global imagination. These were among the first diplomatic letters sent across continents, not just kingdoms. They helped lay the groundwork for the idea that political relationships could stretch beyond empires, across time zones and civilizations. The irony of speed. If the letters had arrived faster, would anything have changed? Perhaps not. The misunderstandings were too deep, the assumptions too lopsided, the ideologies too incompatible. But still the irony remains. The Mongols had created the fastest communication network in the pre-modern world. And yet, the letters from the West arrived late anyway. Because no matter how fast a horse rides, it cannot carry comprehension. And no seal, no matter how holy, can substitute for listening. The sound of an unread letter. Imagine for a moment the scene. You are a Mongol scribe in Karakoram. You receive a leather pouch, carried from distant lands, passed through dozens of hands, mud-splattered and wrinkled. Inside is a letter written in Latin. The ink has run slightly from condensation. The seal is intact, bearing the crossed keys of St. Peter. You unroll the parchment. The handwriting is formal but foreign. You do not speak Latin. You hand it to a Persian translator. He tries his best. He cannot be sure if the letter is asking for peace or surrender. The Khan reads the translation in silence. He sets it down. And then he asks, do they send spices? Final reflection, when distance wins. The story of papal letters to the Mongol Khans is not one of triumph or tragedy. It is a story of distance, physical, cultural, temporal. The popes wrote as if their words could bind distant empires. The Mongols read as if they were being asked to kneel. The earth spun. The letters aged. No one changed. But in these old pages, we find something deeply human. A belief that if we just send the right words, across the right path, at the right time someone will listen. Even when they don't. Story 6. The village that moved an inch a year, the slow collapse of Dunwich. You are standing on the eastern coast of England in the year 1250, near the thriving town of Dunwich. The breeze carries the smell of salt, oak, and drying fish. Ships creak at anchor, and the voices of merchants echo between wooden buildings and stone churches. There are churches, many churches. At least 10 stand tall, their bells sounding the hours to townspeople and travelers alike. This is not a village. This is a city by medieval standards, a prosperous port, a key link in England's coastal trade. At its peak, Dunwich had a bustling harbor, royal charters for trade, its own mint and market, dozens of fishing boats, a defensive earthwork protecting it from inland raiders. It was even considered for a bishopric. But no one here can see what's coming. Because the enemy isn't foreign, it's not even human. It's the sea. And it is patient. The geography that betrayed. Dunwich sits on the Suffolk coast, a part of England made of soft cliffs and shifting shingle. The land is a kind of geological compromise made of clay, sand, and gravel, laid down over thousands of years. It's easily carved by wind and water. There is no natural harbor here. The people of Dunwich had to maintain it, constantly dredging the mouth of the Dunwich River, building wooden breakwaters and shifting sand by hand. But in the 13th century, something began to change. More storms, heavier rains, longer, harsher winters, and the tides began to shift. Historians now think this was the beginning of a global cooling trend, known as the Little Ice Age, a period that would subtly but drastically reshape Europe's climate over the next 500 years. And Dunwich was one of its first casualties. The first warning, 1286. On a cold winter day in 1286, the sea rose higher than usual. A storm, described in local records as the Great Sea Flood, slammed into the coast. It didn't destroy Dunwich, but it did alter the river mouth, blocking the harbor with shingle and shifting the current just enough to confuse incoming ships. Fishermen noticed first. then the merchants, then the town leaders, who debated the cost of dredging. But few thought it permanent. They repaired the harbor. They dug new channels. They prayed. And for a few years, the town recovered. But the coastline had already moved by inches, then feet, then yards. What the records say and don't. We have only fragments of Dunwich's story. The town's official records, including court rolls and trade ledgers, were lost, washed away in storms, or buried in silt. What survives are indirect clues. Writings from Franciscan friars, noting fewer ships arriving by 1290. Letters from inland nobles complaining that Dunwich merchants no longer bring wares as they did. A few entries in tax rolls, where the town's assessed value drops suddenly between decades. The silence in the records is telling. By the time people noticed Dunwich was in trouble, half the damage had already been done. A town rebuilt on memory. By 1300, Dunwich was shrinking. Not economically, physically. Houses near the edge of the cliff were abandoned. Roads rerouted. Entire churchyards began crumbling into the sea. The people moved uphill. They rebuilt what they could. They did not leave. Because the bells still rang. Because the market still opened. Because leaving meant losing not just property but identity. This was still Dunwich, they insisted. Even if it was smaller than last year. Even if you had to walk farther inland to find the old parish stone. The sound of bells beneath the waves. Fishermen generations later would tell stories. They claimed that on still days, you could hear the bells of the old churches ringing beneath the waves. The sound would echo up through the hull, faint and haunting. It was nonsense, of course, but it told a deeper truth. Because by the early 14th century, several of Dunwich's great churches, including All Saints, St. Peter's, and St. Nicholas, had already fallen into the sea. Some went during storms, some over decades. Some were dismantled before the cliffs took them, the stones carted inland to reinforce what remained. But piece by piece, the town disappeared. The beginning of the end. In 1328, another storm struck the coast. By then, Dunwich's harbor was mostly choked with silt. Ships avoided it. Trade had moved north to ports like Yarmouth and King's Lynn. The town tried to raise funds to dig a new channel, but donations fell short. The sea kept taking land faster than people could dig. By the middle of the century, Dunwich was no longer a port. Its harbor was gone, and a town built on salt, fish, and the promise of ships had become an inland village clinging to a coastal ghost. Unresolved thought. You stand on the current shoreline, looking out over gray waves and dull light. Somewhere out there, beneath the silt and salt, lie the stones of a vanished city. And you ask yourself, how long can a town remain alive if the world around it disappears 1 foot at a time? It is now the mid-14th century. The year is 1349, and Dunwich is no longer a thriving port, nor a proud town of 10 churches. Its streets are quieter now. Its harbor, once filled with ships bound for London and Flanders, is silted beyond use. Children throw stones where merchant boats once loaded cargo. The river, diverted, clogged, and confused by decades of storms, now wanders into marshes before fatting into the sea. But on this year, in this moment, Dunwich has something else to worry about. Because now the Black Death has arrived. A town already in retreat. The plague spreads fast. It doesn't care about ports or churches. But Dunwich, already wounded by the sea, now bleeds from within. Half the population may die. Entire households vanish from tax rolls. Livestock wander the streets without owners. But here's the quiet tragedy. Dunwich doesn't collapse suddenly, not like Pompeii or Carthage. It continues, limping, rebuilding, reburying. Its decline is not an event, It's a habit. By this time, several of its churches are abandoned. Some have been swept into the sea. Others, perched too close to crumbling cliffs, stand with one wall half eroded, like broken teeth against the horizon. And yet people remain. They still ring the bells, still call the town by its ancient name, still record births and death in shrinking parish books. Because decline, when it is slow enough, starts to feel like normal life. Erosion by measurement. How fast did Dunwich disappear? Geologists and archaeologists now estimate that coastal erosion at Dunwich averaged 1 to 2 meters per year during major storm centuries, with sudden losses of 10 to 20 meters in catastrophic events, especially in 1286, 1328, and 1347. That may not sound dramatic until you consider that the entire medieval town of Dunwich was less than 1 km wide from the inland edge to the cliffs. In just 2 centuries, the sea had taken most of the streets, the market square, the original port, at least 8 churches, and yet for generations, no one officially declared the town gone. It wasn't destroyed in one night. It was dismantled by tide. Faith on the edge. In All Saints' Church, the last of the major cliffside parishes, sermons continued into the 1400s. Parishioners walked to service past erosion markers. They stepped over old gravestones tilted by slippage. They listened to hymns under vaulted ceilings while knowing that only a few feet beyond the eastern wall, the ground dropped sharply into the surf. The church became a symbol of something deeply medieval. Endurance in the face of decay. Piety on unstable ground. A refusal to move, even as the world washed away. We know that services continued in All Saints for over 100 years, after parts of the graveyard had fallen into the sea. Eventually, it too would fall. But not yet. The sea eats bones. One of the most haunting facts about Dunwich is that its dead could not rest. As cliffside graveyards collapsed into the sea, human remains some hundreds of years old were carried out by the tides. Fishermen reported skulls tangled in nets. Fragments of coffins surfaced after storms. Bones washed ashore like driftwood. It disturbed some. Others simply saw it as part of living near the sea. The church tried to reinter what it could. Some remains were moved inland. Others were left to the waves. There is something deeply unsettling about a town whose past is literally washed away, not just memory, but matter. And yet it continued. 15th, 16th century, the name remains. By 1500, Dunwich was no longer a town. It was a village, stubbornly clinging to its charter. It still elected officials, still sent taxes, though less each year, still called itself a borough. But it was no longer influential. The once busy market square was a memory. The harbor a myth. Maps still labeled it, but often in smaller script. In 1587, the final blow came. Another great storm, likely a North Sea surge, tore away the last major parts of the medieval town. By then, no one was surprised. They mourned briefly, cleared the debris, and continued. Because what else could they do? Unresolved thought. You picture a gravestone, its carving half eroded, teetering on the cliff's edge. Tomorrow it may fall. Next week it may be gone. And yet someone laid flowers there yesterday. You ask yourself, when does a town become a ruin? And when does a ruin become a story told only by waves? It is the early 1600s. Dunwich still exists technically. It is still called a borough, and astonishingly, it still sends 2 members to Parliament, a relic of medieval privilege that will soon become an object of ridicule. Because by this time, Dunwich is no longer a port, no longer a city, barely even a village. It has become a symbol of loss of time and of how a place can vanish physically but persist politically, spiritually, and stubbornly on paper. And yet, despite the silence of its churches and the sea's persistent theft, Dunwich refuses to disappear entirely. Rotten boroughs and ghost votes. Let's begin with something odd. In 1688, Dunwich still sent 2 members of Parliament, MPs, to Westminster. This would be absurd today, but in 17th century Britain, it was technically legal. These places were known as rotten boroughs, political districts that once held significance but had long since lost their population. In Dunwich's case, its influence remained, even as the town itself quite literally slid into the ocean. Parliamentary records show votes cast on behalf of Dunwich well into the 1700s, sometimes by men who had never seen the town, selected by landowners who lived elsewhere. So while the waves took stone and timber, Dunwich's name still shaped laws. Its shadow still governed. This may be the strangest kind of survival, a ghost with voting rights. The final fall of All Saints. The last major ruin of medieval Dunwich was All Saints Church, perched perilously close to the sea by the 1700s. For centuries, locals maintained what they could, propping up walls, salvaging stones, and praying beneath a roof half gone. Eventually, even this became impossible. In 1750, large parts of the cemetery slid into the sea. In 1770, the southern wall collapsed. By 1820, only the tower remained. It stood alone for nearly a century, just one tower, wind-scoured, visible from the cliff as a final sentinel. But the cliff continued to crumble. In 1911, the tower itself fell into the sea, and with it, the last upright piece of medieval Dunwich was gone. What lies beneath? Today, the original medieval town of Dunwich lies underwater, about 10-15 meters offshore. In recent years, sonar and underwater archaeology projects have mapped the drowned ruins. What they've found includes foundations of multiple stone churches, traces of the old high street, wooden harbor structures embedded in silt, dozens of domestic dwellings, now no more than outlines. The sea didn't obliterate Dunwich, it simply relocated it. Like Pompeii beneath volcanic ash, Dunwich now exists in negative space, not built up but washed out. Coastal amnesia. Ask the average traveler in England today where Dunwich is, and you'll likely be met with a blank stare. Unlike famous ruined cities, it left behind no castles, no grand cathedrals, no tourist-attracting monuments. Its legacy is more subtle, a lesson about fragility, embedded in maps and the sediment layers of an eroding coast. Historians speak of coastal amnesia, a cultural forgetting of places that slip away slowly, too gradually to make headlines. Dunwich didn't die a dramatic death. It just moved, quietly, inches at a time. Dunwich today. There is still a Dunwich. Today, it is a hamlet of about 100 people, located about a kilometer inland from where the original medieval town stood. It has a museum dedicated to the lost city, a tea room and an old pub, a peaceful heath preserved by the National Trust, an unmarked shore where the sea continues its patient work. It is, in every sense, a peaceful place to forget history. But beneath that calm, beneath the sand and seaweed, lie the ghosts of stone. The bell tolls underwater. Fishermen still repeat the old legend. On quiet days, when the sea is still, you can hear the bells of the churches tolling beneath the waves. It's not true, of course. The sound is likely seabirds, wind, or memory itself. But the story endures. Because somewhere in every vanished place, people imagine that echoes remain not in air, but in feeling. And that perhaps the past, while no longer visible, is never truly gone. What Dunwich teaches. the story of Dunwich is not exciting. There are no epic battles, no plagues of fire, no heroes standing defiantly at city gates. What it offers instead is the humility of nature's pace, the dull power of erosion, the reality that decay can be honorable, and the strange endurance of memory without monument. Dunwich was never conquered. It was not abandoned in a single day. It was remembered only because it insisted on being counted, even as the sea erased its footprints. Final reflection. So much of history is told in victories and defeats, in revolutions and declarations. But what of the quiet disappearances? What of towns like Dunwich, where the enemy was tied, and the war lasted centuries, and the outcome was not loss but gentle erasure? You wonder, if Dunwich, once proud and powerful, could be lost so slowly that no one stopped it, how many others have vanished the same way, never written down at all?